Hello everyone, and welcome to the 102 Hours YouTube channel. Tonight we step cautiously into the dim corners of one of America's most elusive and disturbing true crime mysteries, the decades-long case of the Unabomber. Imagine a quiet suburban neighborhood, mailboxes neatly lined up, waiting innocently in the morning sun. A mail carrier casually slips envelopes and parcels into each box, unaware that he's delivering terror wrapped in plain brown paper. You probably won't survive this story without checking your own mailbox twice tomorrow, a grim little reality check courtesy of tonight's chilling journey. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a quick comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always intriguing to picture all of you listening from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing quietly on a shaded street in Evergreen Park, Illinois, just outside bustling Chicago. It's the early 1950s, a time often idealized as America's golden age: white picket fences, neatly kept lawns, and neighborly gatherings. But behind one of those doors, things aren't quite so picture-perfect. Inside lives a family, the Kaczynskis, Polish immigrants striving to carve out a modest piece of the American dream. Their eldest son, Theodore, or Ted as he is quietly called, sits alone at the dining table, his young eyes scanning over a mathematics textbook well beyond his years. Right from the start, Ted Kaczynski's brilliance is evident. By elementary school, his intellect astounds teachers who quickly recognize him as exceptionally gifted. But along with this astonishing talent comes something else, something darker, something harder to pin down. Ted often isolates himself, rarely mixing with his peers, preferring puzzles, mathematical riddles, and solitary hobbies. While other boys his age play ball outside or chase each other through the neighborhood, Ted sits quietly, studying equations and logic puzzles. A neighbor might gently joke that young Ted could probably crack military codes, unaware of how prophetic those words might one day become. This isolation isn't entirely self-imposed. As you quietly observe Ted's childhood, you see that he suffers bouts of severe illness in his early years, including a long hospitalization as an infant that leaves him emotionally withdrawn. Historians still argue whether early childhood traumas like these are definitive triggers for later antisocial behaviors or simply unfortunate coincidences. Regardless, in Ted's case, the seeds of withdrawal and mistrust seem firmly planted in these early experiences, embedding themselves deeper into his developing personality. In school, despite his evident brilliance, classmates find him awkward, eccentric, and distant. Ted's teachers, while impressed by his intellect, note troubling behaviors, a refusal to participate in group activities, extreme anxiety when asked to speak in front of others, and occasional bouts of stubborn defiance. These observations create a troubling psychological profile even at such a young age. One quirky yet telling tidbit from his early years: classmates recall how Ted meticulously sharpened each pencil to a precise point, obsessively arranging his desk to perfection before beginning work, a subtle foreshadowing of the rigid and compulsive adult he would later become. Moving into high school, Ted becomes increasingly aware of his isolation, and yet, paradoxically, he does nothing to bridge the gap. Instead, he drifts deeper into his own solitary universe, fascinated by scientific advancements, yet profoundly suspicious of the technological transformations sweeping through post-war America. His mistrust of technology quietly simmers, forming a cornerstone of what would later become his chilling ideological manifesto. Ted's parents, while supportive, struggle to understand their son. They recognize his remarkable potential but find themselves bewildered by his cold detachment and obsessive routines. Their well-intentioned attempts at intervention, arranging playdates, encouraging social clubs, rarely produce positive outcomes. Instead, these forced interactions often reinforce Ted's discomfort and deepen his resolve to withdraw further. The family home becomes quietly tense, as though everyone is holding their breath, waiting for something they cannot yet name. As Ted's adolescence unfolds, this tension within him only deepens. He becomes fascinated with radical ideas, quietly questioning authority and society's reliance on technology. He reads voraciously, consuming books on philosophy, psychology, and revolutionary thinkers. In one eerie parallel, Ted idolizes Henry David Thoreau, dreaming of one day retreating into wilderness solitude himself, completely disconnected from a society he increasingly views as corrupted and dangerous. By the time Ted graduates high school, he is deeply embedded in his world of abstract thought, suspicion, and isolation. Brilliant but alienated, talented but troubled, he seems poised on a knife's edge. The invisible fractures within him are widening, cracks that will soon lead him down a disturbing path. And you stand now on the cusp of this story, feeling the weight of what's coming next. Ted Kaczynski is about to enter Harvard University, a place known for shaping young minds but one that will, in his case, further intensify the psychological strain already evident. Before we take that next chilling step, remember this first section carefully. Every eerie clue, every odd detail, will echo forward through the years, haunting the manhunt that will eventually grip an entire nation. Tonight's journey has just begun. Hold on to the small details, like the precise way young Ted sharpened his pencils, because in a story this intricate, nothing is trivial. Every quiet moment, every early sign, will soon weave into the fabric of terror. You find yourself standing now on the polished marble floors of Harvard University in the autumn of 1958, surrounded by towering columns and ivy-covered walls. The campus is alive with youthful energy, ambition spilling over into the air like invisible electricity. But amid this bustling atmosphere, one figure stands distinctly apart, Ted Kaczynski, barely 16, already marked by profound isolation. You can see him clearly, solitary and distant, moving quietly through bustling crowds of students who barely notice him. He's the youngest in his class by several years, an oddity, admired for his staggering intellect but quietly avoided due to his rigid, awkward demeanor. Harvard's history is rich, having produced leaders, inventors, and scholars, but it also harbors darker tales, psychological experiments, buried secrets, studies pushed beyond ethical limits. As you wander these halls, you might remember that even brilliant institutions have their shadows. Harvard would soon provide the crucible for Ted's deepening paranoia and distrust of society, and scholars continue to debate just how profoundly these years shaped him. Historians still argue whether a vulnerable mind, when pushed too hard, can fracture permanently or if such experiments merely revealed cracks already present. It isn't long before Ted attracts attention from professors for his brilliant aptitude, especially in mathematics. His mind handles complex theories effortlessly, but his social interactions remain painfully awkward. Classmates later recall him as aloof, rarely speaking except when directly addressed. In one quirky anecdote, he reportedly leaves lecture halls immediately after class ends, head down, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Even his dorm mates scarcely know his name. But perhaps most crucially, and most disturbingly, Ted becomes involved in a controversial psychological study led by Dr. Henry Murray. Murray, a respected Harvard psychologist, is fascinated by the human response to stress and anxiety. He carefully selects participants, looking specifically for bright, vulnerable students. Ted fits perfectly. The study involves intensive and often humiliating interrogations, in which participants' deeply held beliefs are aggressively challenged and mocked. The sessions are recorded, replayed, analyzed, and scrutinized. Imagine Ted, sitting alone in a dimly lit room, face to face with a hostile interrogator who systematically dismantles his every belief. His ideals are mocked, his insecurities exposed and ridiculed, each session more grueling than the last. The intent is to measure psychological resilience, but for Ted, it's an emotional siege, an assault on his developing identity. As these sessions continue, Ted becomes increasingly withdrawn, suspicious, and cynical, exactly the opposite effect one might hope to see from such experimentation. These experiments have since come under intense scrutiny for their questionable ethics and long-term psychological impacts. Historians still argue whether Murray's methods, now viewed by many as cruel, might have deepened existing fractures in Ted's mental health or even directly triggered them. Could these psychological pressures have accelerated Ted's descent into radical isolationism? Or were they merely another piece in a far more complex puzzle? While enduring these experiments, Ted's life outside the study continues in a solitary fashion. His grades remain impeccable, but emotionally, he's slipping further into isolation. In fact, professors note his growing unwillingness to engage beyond academic necessities. Ted avoids campus social events, rarely attends parties, and seems to drift even further into the intellectual fringes. While his peers debate ideas at cafes, Ted is alone, scribbling notes filled with increasingly intense critiques of modern society and its destructive obsession with technological advancement. One unsettling detail from this time is Ted's growing obsession with literature depicting resistance to societal structures. He devours books by revolutionary thinkers and fringe philosophers, silently agreeing with their radical ideas about rejecting modernity and civilization. In particular, his fascination deepens with the works of Thoreau, Nietzsche, and Jacques Ellul, whose writings fiercely criticize technological dominance. Ted's personal journals soon become filled with biting critiques of technology and modern society, laying the ideological groundwork for what will later appear in his notorious Manifesto. As the months and years at Harvard roll by, Ted's mental landscape transforms. His emotional resilience deteriorates. The lines blur between suspicion and paranoia, and between intellectual rebellion and obsessive hostility. He feels targeted, isolated, and alienated. Increasingly, he views institutions, authorities, and technology itself as threats, enemies silently conspiring to strip individuals of freedom and autonomy. You might find yourself briefly sympathizing with the younger Ted, caught in a turbulent psychological struggle within one of America's most prestigious institutions. But sympathy gives way to apprehension as his quiet anger solidifies. By the time he graduates from Harvard, Ted is not just intellectually brilliant, he's profoundly alienated, angry, and dangerously convinced that society itself is corrupt, oppressive, and ultimately deserving of destruction. Standing now on the edge of this phase of Ted's journey, you can almost feel the tension that coils tightly around him. Harvard, a place meant to mold brilliant minds, has ironically left him damaged, suspicious, and primed for radicalization. Those psychological experiments, now infamous for their ethical breaches, had unknowingly sharpened the edges of Ted's paranoia. Remember this carefully as we move forward. Ted's ideological evolution here is not merely academic. It is personal, emotional, and disturbingly deep-rooted. The loneliness and alienation nurtured at Harvard will soon drive him toward a much darker path, one from which there's no turning back. The next stage, his flight into wilderness isolation, will become the incubator for something far more sinister. From the shadows of Harvard's ivy-covered halls, you now drift quietly into the stillness of the Montana wilderness. It's the early 1970s, a period often romanticized in popular imagination for its free spirits, peace movements, and back-to-nature ideals. But Ted Kaczynski's retreat into the wild holds none of these idyllic qualities. Instead, it's a cold, calculated escape, a self-imposed exile designed to sever all ties with modern civilization, which he increasingly perceives as oppressive, dangerous, and irreversibly corrupted by technology. You find yourself standing at the edge of Lincoln, Montana, a tiny community tucked neatly within dense forests and rugged mountains. It's the kind of place that tourists imagine is perfect for disconnecting from the world. But for Kaczynski, it isn't merely a temporary getaway, it's the chosen site of permanent isolation. With meticulous precision, he selects a remote plot of land, a secluded stretch nestled among tall pines, utterly inaccessible during harsh winters, and difficult to reach even during mild seasons. This cabin, built by hand from salvaged wood and scrap materials, becomes his fortress, small, stark, and stripped of modern conveniences. No electricity. No running water. Just quiet, relentless solitude. As you step closer, imagining the crisp bite of Montana air, you peer inside this tiny structure, a place where simplicity and rigidity collide. A small wood stove stands against one wall, piles of neatly stacked firewood nearby. Books and handwritten notebooks are carefully aligned on sparse shelves. Every detail is precisely organized, reflecting Ted's intense, almost compulsive need for control. This orderliness, initially innocuous, soon transforms into something quietly menacing, as meticulous planning becomes the backbone of a violent future. In the early days, Ted's wilderness life seems nearly philosophical, echoing Thoreau's Walden experiment, a man living simply, self-reliant, free from the entanglements of modern society. He spends hours hunting, gathering food, and carefully cultivating a garden, rejecting any connection to the conveniences of town life. But beneath this veneer of peaceful independence, Ted's mind simmers restlessly. Each quiet day spent alone sharpens his resolve, deepening his anger toward society. As his isolation grows, the borders between thoughtful reflection and dangerous obsession blur dangerously. Historians still argue whether Kaczynski's withdrawal into the wilderness was primarily philosophical or if it marked a deliberate step toward calculated violence. Was it intended as a peaceful rebellion against modernity, or was it always part of something darker, a way to prepare for and justify his destructive acts? Regardless of the answer, one thing remains clear: here, hidden in this remote cabin, he solidifies his ideas, meticulously drafting and refining a critique that will soon justify terrible deeds. Ironically, despite his fierce opposition to technology, Kaczynski relies extensively on printed books and scientific journals, regularly making lengthy trips to libraries in nearby towns. With each journey, you sense the internal contradiction growing. He's rejecting modern society yet depending on its products to fuel his outrage. In these quiet contradictions, a quirky but chilling tidbit emerges. Ted's frequent trips to town libraries became so habitual that locals quietly dubbed him the hermit scholar, unaware of the menace quietly building behind those thoughtful eyes. Days turn into months, months into years, and Ted's ideological stance hardens further. His journals fill with increasingly radical statements. Society, technology, government, each becomes a symbol of oppression, worthy targets of violent retribution. You can almost hear the scratching of his pen against paper, methodically planning not just theories but actions. Here in this small cabin, hidden from civilization, an isolated mind grows darker by the day, slowly transitioning from quiet resentment into a cold determination to act. And act he does, though subtly at first. Initially, he performs minor sabotage against local logging equipment, quietly venting his anger toward those he sees destroying nature. Yet, it's not enough. These early actions seem trivial compared to the chaos he imagines. It's around this time, as the early 1970s slip quietly into the mid-70s, that Ted's anger crystallizes into a frightening conviction: peaceful protest is futile. The only language modern society will understand, he reasons, is violence. It's chilling to consider how neatly Kaczynski fits into a disturbing historical pattern. Many infamous criminals initially retreat from society before striking out violently. Think of Ed Gein, hiding his madness behind rural isolation, or Eric Rudolph, plotting destructive acts deep in the wilderness. Ted's choice to isolate himself so completely is not merely a philosophical gesture but a psychological strategy, enabling him to shed societal restraints and moral qualms that might otherwise have stopped him. Standing outside the cabin once more, feeling the wind whispering through the pines, you reflect on how subtly but decisively isolation can alter a mind. In solitude, fears amplify. Suspicions become certainties. Without counterbalance, paranoia flourishes. Ted Kaczynski, alone in his cabin, is now utterly convinced that modern society is a monster, one deserving total annihilation. But even as he builds his ideological fortress, Ted maintains a nearly invisible presence. Town residents barely notice him, and those who do see merely a quiet, eccentric loner. Even local law enforcement, accustomed to dealing with rugged individualists, pays little attention to the reclusive man in the woods. His invisibility is precisely what makes him so dangerous. By the late 1970s, Theodore Kaczynski has completely transformed from a withdrawn scholar into something far more ominous, an invisible predator, quietly preparing his first strikes. As you watch this isolated cabin grow smaller behind you, remember it well. This silent, lonely structure nestled in Montana's wilderness becomes the crucible in which Ted's radical ideas fuse with violent plans. Every hour spent alone within these walls strengthens his resolve. Every notebook filled deepens his hatred. And every silence endured sharpens the blade of his determination to strike fear into the heart of the society he despises. The calm quietness of Montana's wilderness is deceiving. Beneath its tranquility lies something dangerous, volatile, and utterly prepared to explode. Ted Kaczynski's exile here isn't a retreat from civilization, it's the preparation ground for an assault against it. Hold tightly onto the unsettling silence of this place, because from here, things only get darker. You find yourself now quietly stepping into the unsettling calm of 1978. America hums along unsuspectingly, the air filled with the usual blend of suburban routine and technological optimism. People move effortlessly between daily chores, work meetings, and casual conversation, entirely unaware that a hidden menace is silently preparing to disrupt their ordinary lives. Mail carriers still smile and wave, parcels exchanged without suspicion, because nobody imagines a package could carry death instead of birthday gifts or friendly letters. But behind the anonymity of routine, Ted Kaczynski meticulously prepares his first sinister act, carefully assembling an explosive device designed to terrify, injure, and kill. Every piece of his homemade bomb is crafted by hand, its components mundane yet deadly, scraps of metal, wires from discarded electronics, a simple yet devastating trigger mechanism. Kaczynski, alone in his small Montana cabin, perfects these crude but effective explosives through methodical trial and error, obsessive precision marking each deadly step. And then, quietly, he mails the first bomb, carefully wrapped and addressed, entirely anonymous. This initial device, sent in May 1978, targets Northwestern University professor Buckley Crist. But fate intervenes, the parcel seems suspicious, slightly off in appearance, prompting Crist to contact campus security. An officer, Terry Marker, cautiously opens the package. It detonates with a sharp blast, causing injuries, minor, but deeply shocking. Suddenly, with that single terrifying explosion, the decades-long Unabomber saga has begun. Standing in the aftermath, you can almost sense the confusion rippling outward. Who would send such a device? Why target a university? For law enforcement, the incident initially seems random, puzzling, even isolated. Yet, hidden behind this puzzlement is something even more frightening, the complete anonymity of the attack. There's no clear motive, no explicit message, and certainly no perpetrator to question. The first bomb becomes not merely an act of violence but a chilling statement of intent. Someone unknown is now quietly at war with modern society. Over the following months, Kaczynski strikes again, still unnoticed, still anonymous. His next device targets Northwestern once more, this time injuring a graduate student. You imagine the campus community now tense, whispers of paranoia filtering through lecture halls, libraries, and faculty meetings. Who is next? What does the bomber want? The absence of answers amplifies fear, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and uncertainty. The Unabomber's early attacks are deceptively simple, small-scale in damage, but psychologically immense. They spread quiet panic, prompting many to fear even the most ordinary mail delivery. Historical context sharpens this fear. Remember, it's the late 1970s, an era when America is still reeling from high-profile violence. Serial killers like the Son of Sam, the Zodiac Killer, and Ted Bundy dominate headlines. The FBI, stretched thin, already struggles with multiple high-profile cases. Into this climate of anxiety steps the Unabomber, whose anonymous bombs force federal agents to face a new, unfamiliar challenge: domestic terrorism carried out entirely in secret. A quirky yet grim tidbit emerges from these early attacks. Despite their crude nature, Kaczynski's bombs are filled with peculiar, almost obsessive details. Each bomb has subtle marks or symbols etched inside, seemingly random yet strikingly intentional. Investigators initially miss these details, believing them meaningless, but later they will understand these tiny marks as a kind of twisted signature, an obsessive, compulsive clue left by a meticulous mind desperate for recognition but unwilling to risk identification. Historians still argue whether these early bombings were deliberately low impact as part of a calculated strategy or merely early experiments by a man still perfecting his deadly craft. Did Kaczynski intend these early attacks as warnings, initial tremors preceding a larger seismic shift? Or was he simply refining his methods, testing the effectiveness of his destructive potential? The uncertainty surrounding his motivations adds yet another layer of disturbing mystery to the case, fueling fear and confusion for investigators and the public alike. As months pass quietly after these initial strikes, some begin to hope the attacks were isolated incidents. Perhaps, they suggest cautiously, the bomber has stopped, deterred by investigative efforts or afraid of capture. But Kaczynski's silence is not surrender, it's preparation. During these quiet months, he returns to his cabin, meticulously perfecting new devices, obsessively planning future targets, studying ways to evade detection more effectively. You might imagine him during these solitary hours, surrounded by the quiet hum of wilderness, carefully refining his bombs, carefully selecting each new target with deliberate logic. This patient precision marks him as uniquely dangerous, unlike impulsive criminals who leave obvious clues. Kaczynski is invisible, patient, and determined, a hunter waiting silently in the shadows. Then, in late 1979, he emerges once again, more confident, more precise. He places a homemade bomb aboard American Airlines Flight 444, hidden inside the cargo hold. Miraculously, a faulty timing mechanism prevents the full detonation, causing smoke and chaos but no fatalities. Still, this bold, frightening escalation prompts intense federal investigation. The FBI officially labels the case Unabomber, University and Airline Bomber, a grim acronym that quickly grips national attention. The failed airline bombing is significant. It's a chilling escalation, signaling Kaczynski's willingness to inflict mass casualties. No longer content with small, symbolic acts, he now aims directly at institutions symbolizing modern life, universities, airlines, corporations, each representing the technological advancement and societal corruption he passionately despises. From this point forward, investigators recognize something even more alarming. This bomber isn't driven by personal vengeance, greed, or madness alone. He's driven by ideology, a cold, calculated belief system that justifies his escalating violence. As you step away from this chaotic scene, passengers evacuated safely, smoke dissipating, FBI agents quietly frustrated, consider the terrifying realization now dawning upon authorities: an invisible enemy, profoundly ideological, patient, and careful, has declared war on American society. The first bombings were no random acts, they were early tremors, harbingers of escalating terror. The anonymous predator who began in quiet solitude has now made his deadly presence known, marking an irrevocable turning point in American history. Every new package, every unopened parcel now carries a sinister possibility. Ted Kaczynski's early attacks have fundamentally changed public perception of ordinary life. Quiet, routine acts now become tense moments of doubt and suspicion, rippling quietly across communities nationwide. The Unabomber is here, silent, determined, and relentless, and the nightmare is just beginning. You now find yourself stepping into the quiet chaos of the early 1980s, when Ted Kaczynski's bombs begin shaping a new, darker American reality, one marked by suspicion, anxiety, and a pervasive sense of invisible danger. Imagine the ordinary morning ritual of checking your mailbox, feeling a sudden hesitation you never knew before. You pause, fingers resting on cold metal, and wonder briefly if something sinister could be hiding behind such an innocuous act. This is precisely the type of psychological terror that Ted Kaczynski so skillfully sows, using anonymity itself as a weapon, leaving authorities increasingly frustrated and desperate for answers. As the bombing spree quietly continues, a rising panic starts gripping public consciousness. News bulletins highlight each attack in grim detail, painting an invisible enemy lurking just beyond the edges of everyday life. The FBI's Unabomber task force is born amid this mounting fear, initially small, later becoming one of the largest and most expensive investigations in American criminal history. Yet despite increased resources and relentless effort, investigators struggle to make meaningful progress. You might imagine the frustration of FBI agents, sitting long hours at desks piled high with scattered notes and dead-end clues, poring over forensic details, searching desperately for patterns that refuse to reveal themselves. Profilers attempt to build psychological portraits of the unknown bomber, piecing together scattered evidence into a coherent identity. Yet their best efforts yield only vague, contradictory sketches. Perhaps he's a disgruntled former academic, a failed airline worker, or an anti-establishment activist. Without clear motives or demands, the Unabomber remains a ghost, mocking their efforts from afar. And Ted Kaczynski watches silently from his Montana solitude, carefully reading news accounts of each attack, quietly satisfied with the confusion and terror his anonymity generates. In his remote cabin, isolated yet intellectually connected through newspapers and books, he obsessively follows coverage of his bombings, noting law enforcement responses and meticulously adjusting his methods. Each strike is slightly different from the last, deliberately calculated to avoid establishing an obvious pattern, making detection infinitely harder. A quirky yet chilling detail emerges during this period. Each of Kaczynski's bombs includes intentionally misleading clues, subtle but enough to distract investigators. He carefully leaves false trails, a fragment of wood from a region far from Montana, wires from consumer products easily obtainable anywhere, obscure references that hint at targets unrelated to his ideology. Investigators initially interpret these as mistakes or sloppiness, but eventually realize something far more troubling. Their invisible adversary is intentionally confusing them, taunting them with false leads to prolong their frustration. Historians still argue whether Kaczynski's deliberate misdirection demonstrates sophisticated criminal intelligence or simply obsessive paranoia. Is he a calculated mastermind strategically evading capture, or merely compulsive, driven by an obsessive need to maintain control? Regardless, the result remains disturbingly effective. Every false clue deepens investigators' confusion, making the search feel hopelessly endless. By 1985, the Unabomber's quiet reign of terror becomes painfully familiar, regularly punctuating American life with anxiety. Bombs appear sporadically yet persistently, targeting universities, computer stores, airline offices, and scientific researchers, always places representing technological advancement and modern civilization, Ted's perceived enemies. Victims range from professors to secretaries, engineers to store owners. Some survive with terrible injuries, lifelong scars serving as constant reminders of an invisible attacker. Tragically, others are less fortunate. This relentless uncertainty eats away at America's sense of security. Public institutions increase mail screening procedures, install surveillance cameras, and reinforce security measures, changes that quietly reshape daily life. Citizens become wary of receiving unexpected packages, even from familiar sources. Post offices report surges in suspicious package reports, most false alarms but vividly illustrating the psychological damage inflicted by an unseen adversary. Yet through all these attacks, Kaczynski's underlying message remains silent, his purpose unexplained, his ideological motivations hidden. Authorities wonder bitterly why the bomber hasn't communicated demands or taken credit publicly. Most terrorists thrive on publicity and acknowledgement, yet the Unabomber remains utterly silent. This absence of communication, this ghostly silence, is perhaps his most chilling tactic. It means anyone, anywhere, could be next, without ever knowing why. Meanwhile, quietly hidden inside FBI headquarters, frustration simmers into desperation. The case files grow thicker, leads multiplying but rarely advancing. Agents interview hundreds of potential suspects, from disgruntled employees to former professors and radical activists. Each interrogation ends disappointingly, another dead end, another false hope. For investigators, the Unabomber case becomes not merely professional, it becomes intensely personal, each unresolved bombing fueling their sense of failure. The investigation's slow, grinding pace takes a toll on agents. Some quietly admit their fear that the bomber may never be caught, that he might quietly vanish into history, a terrifying enigma never solved. Agents privately worry they're chasing shadows, ghosts created by their own frustration, leaving a permanent stain on law enforcement's credibility. Imagine the psychological toll, chasing invisible threats year after year without progress, without answers, without closure. Yet, ironically, amid this mounting desperation, Ted Kaczynski himself quietly struggles internally. His cabin life, initially idealized solitude, has grown increasingly difficult. Each winter becomes harder, each isolation deeper, each bombing more demanding emotionally and psychologically. You imagine him quietly grappling with his own humanity, wrestling silently with the moral weight of his actions. Though convinced of his ideological righteousness, he nonetheless suffers quiet doubts, internal struggles he reveals only in cryptic journal entries found much later. Standing now at this pivotal moment, midway through the Unabomber saga, you sense something quietly shifting beneath the surface. Law enforcement grows desperate, public fear deepens, yet Kaczynski himself is quietly wearing thin, emotionally drained by prolonged solitude and relentless paranoia. His anonymity, once a source of strength, slowly begins suffocating him, isolating him not just physically but emotionally and mentally. Something must soon give way, either in the FBI's direction or Kaczynski's psychological resilience. But for now, uncertainty still reigns. Public life quietly adjusts to constant fear, investigators remain trapped in endless frustration, and Kaczynski, alone in his wilderness cabin, carefully prepares another bomb. His war against technology, civilization, and modern life continues quietly, invisibly, relentlessly, reshaping America's psychological landscape with every explosive package mailed. Remember this quietly terrifying uncertainty clearly. It's about to give way to something more visible, more public, more dangerous. But for now, you remain locked in quiet suspense, watching America's invisible enemy carefully prepare his next strike, silently reshaping a nation's psyche, one mailbox at a time. You now drift deeper into the tangled web of frustration enveloping the FBI's Unabomber investigation as the mid-1980s blend quietly into the early 1990s. Years have passed since that first explosion, yet investigators remain mired in a maddening cycle of false leads, cryptic clues, and bitter disappointment. You can almost feel the exhaustion radiating off their desks, stacked with mountains of paperwork, crowded with lists of names scratched through in frustration, and profiles rewritten a dozen times but never seeming to quite match the elusive bomber who remains hauntingly anonymous. By now, the FBI has assembled a sprawling task force dedicated solely to hunting this phantom. But the irony isn't lost on you. Despite their vast resources, seasoned expertise, and relentless dedication, agents remain hopelessly stuck, chasing shadows. It's as though they're boxing blindfolded, always throwing punches but rarely landing a solid hit. The Unabomber's anonymity proves far more powerful than any forensic evidence or psychological profile, quietly mocking even their best investigative efforts. At this stage, FBI agents face a frustrating paradox. Every bombing provides clues, yet each clue merely leads them deeper into confusion. Investigators dissect every microscopic detail, tiny metal fragments, bits of wire, scraps of paper, even postage stamps, hoping desperately to find that one crucial mistake, that single careless oversight the bomber might have finally made. Yet every time they think they've found a lead, it quietly evaporates under scrutiny. Historians still argue whether the FBI's intensive profiling methods actually hindered rather than helped this investigation. Profilers had long been praised for cracking notorious cases, famously identifying serial killers like Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway. But in the Unabomber case, their carefully crafted profiles may have quietly led investigators astray, causing them to overlook simpler possibilities in favor of elaborate, psychologically intricate theories. Initially, profilers speculated the Unabomber must be a disgruntled airline employee or former academic, someone bitterly seeking revenge against institutions that wronged him personally. This theory had strong backing initially. After all, targets included airlines and universities. But the theory quietly unraveled as attacks expanded to seemingly unrelated targets, computer stores, engineering executives, timber industry lobbyists, making personal grievance seem increasingly unlikely. Investigators had unwittingly built boxes around their thinking, boxes Ted Kaczynski silently exploited, deliberately breaking expected patterns. Adding to investigators' frustrations were Kaczynski's obsessive and intricate misdirections. One quirky yet chilling detail emerges clearly: each bomb was constructed using purposely common materials, easily sourced nationwide. Kaczynski's cabin held countless books on forensic investigation methods, meticulously studied to ensure he never repeated detectable patterns. He even took extreme precautions, carefully removing fingerprints, fibers, and identifiable marks from each explosive. Agents initially interpreted this meticulousness as the hallmark of a professional, possibly ex-military or intelligence-trained, yet another misleading assumption. Kaczynski had never held such positions, simply taught himself from library books, proving far more careful than most professionally trained criminals. Meanwhile, quietly isolated within his cabin, Ted Kaczynski finds perverse satisfaction in the investigators' frustration, meticulously following the case through newspapers and radio reports. You can imagine him hunched over piles of notes, silently marking the FBI's failed attempts, methodically adjusting his tactics. Each failed lead quietly reinforces his belief in his superiority, deepening his conviction that modern society is flawed, vulnerable, and easily manipulated. Yet, beneath the surface, Kaczynski's obsessive secrecy creates its own pressures. Paranoia consumes him. Every passing plane overhead becomes suspicious. Every unfamiliar noise outside his cabin triggers quiet panic. His life, meticulously constructed around control, spirals slowly into deeper anxiety. This invisible battle of wits between Kaczynski and investigators becomes psychological warfare, with both sides suffering quietly yet intensely from exhaustion, paranoia, and mounting desperation. FBI agents quietly grapple with personal tolls as well. Many struggle emotionally, burdened by public criticism and media scrutiny, harshly accusing them of incompetence. Some agents privately confess their fears that the bomber may never be caught, fears compounded every time news reports another explosion, another victim injured or killed. Public frustration grows palpable, pressuring authorities relentlessly. People demand answers, accountability, and justice, yet investigators feel helplessly trapped, chasing a phantom always one step ahead. By the early 1990s, the FBI's desperation triggers unprecedented moves, openly soliciting public tips nationwide, releasing detailed information previously withheld, hoping someone, anyone, recognizes something familiar. Thousands of tips pour in, overwhelming investigators with false leads, conspiracy theories, and vague suspicions, most proving useless. Yet quietly buried within these mountains of tips lies one crucial piece of information, a small, seemingly insignificant clue initially overlooked. But that comes later. Now, investigators still quietly sift through chaos, unaware relief is silently hidden among thousands of useless leads. You might sense a strange historical echo here. True crime history often reveals how public desperation can simultaneously help and hinder investigations. In famous cases like the Zodiac Killer or Jack the Ripper, overwhelming public response led detectives down countless wrong paths, frustrating progress even while providing essential clues. Kaczynski's case proves similarly complicated. Public cooperation brings valuable information, yet simultaneously floods investigators with misleading tips, deepening their frustration and exhaustion. Yet quietly beneath this public chaos, a psychological shift occurs within Kaczynski himself. Solitude, once his greatest ally, becomes increasingly oppressive. His meticulous isolation breeds deeper paranoia, quiet doubts gnawing at him late into the night. His journals begin revealing cracks, uncertainty, loneliness, exhaustion, quietly humanizing this mysterious figure. Though still ideologically convinced, Kaczynski finds emotional fatigue quietly creeping in, questioning how long he can sustain this hidden war. So now you find yourself at another quiet turning point. Investigators are increasingly exhausted, public patience thin, and Kaczynski's own psychological resilience fraying quietly. A showdown seems inevitable. Something must break soon, either the FBI's stalemate or Kaczynski's self-control. For now, though, the quiet stalemate persists, tensions simmering invisibly beneath public awareness. As you step back quietly from this tense period, hold on to its quiet desperation. The FBI, though deeply frustrated, unknowingly edges closer to a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Kaczynski, despite outward control, quietly begins losing grip internally. The invisible war between hunter and hunted approaches a critical turning point, each side quietly exhausted yet utterly determined. For now, the FBI continues their desperate chase, Kaczynski maintains relentless secrecy, and America remains gripped by quiet terror. But remember this moment clearly, soon everything quietly shifts, and anonymity itself quietly unravels. You're now quietly moving deeper into the mid-1990s, a tense time marked by a disturbing escalation in Kaczynski's attacks and a crucial turning point in his hidden war. After nearly 2 decades of anonymous terror, Ted Kaczynski's meticulous planning and obsessive caution have elevated him from a quiet menace to a national crisis. The FBI, weary and desperate, now faces not just public scrutiny but political pressure as well, intensifying the hunt for the elusive bomber. In this relentless climate, Kaczynski makes a bold and deeply strategic move. He decides to break his long silence. Not with personal demands or private threats, but with something far more calculated and audacious, a written manifesto, meticulously crafted, demanding publication in major national newspapers. You might sense the profound irony here, a man who fiercely guards his anonymity now openly risks exposure, driven by an intense need for society to finally hear his message clearly. Kaczynski's manifesto, formally titled Industrial Society and Its Future, is a dense, carefully argued critique of modern technological society, fiercely condemning humanity's dependence on machines and the consequent loss of individual freedom. The document is lengthy, painstakingly detailed, mixing philosophical arguments with radical calls for revolution against technological domination. Its careful language and scholarly tone make it deeply unsettling. This isn't the rant of an irrational madman, but the cold, calculated arguments of someone deeply convinced by their ideology. The FBI, already under intense pressure, faces an unprecedented ethical and tactical dilemma. Should they encourage publication, hoping someone might recognize the bomber's distinctive writing style, or should they deny him the public platform he desperately seeks, potentially provoking further violence? Historians still argue whether this decision was a calculated risk or simply desperate guesswork born from prolonged frustration. Regardless, agents realize this manifesto presents the first genuine opportunity in years. Finally, the Unabomber himself has provided them with a tangible clue, his own words potentially betraying him. Imagine the tense atmosphere in the FBI headquarters, agents debating fiercely around crowded tables, weighing potential consequences of publication. Some argue strongly that denying publication could trigger an even more deadly response from Kaczynski, increasing casualties and deepening public fear. Others passionately counter that granting him publication sets a dangerous precedent, effectively negotiating with domestic terrorism. This ethical debate sharply divides investigators, complicating an already deeply complex investigation. Yet, beneath their public debates, FBI linguists quietly work to analyze the manifesto's language meticulously. They dissect sentence structure, vocabulary, punctuation, even spelling quirks, hoping desperately for unique linguistic markers to finally identify the author. You imagine specialists poring over every phrase, carefully examining nuances that might reveal regional influences, education levels, or professional backgrounds. This method, linguistic forensic analysis, was relatively novel at the time, having been famously successful in other historical investigations, such as identifying the author of anonymous threatening letters in several notorious stalking cases. As the FBI wrestles internally, newspapers face their own intense dilemma. After much consideration, in September 1995, both the Washington Post and the New York Times decide to publish Kaczynski's manifesto in full, hoping publication might finally yield decisive clues. Millions of readers nationwide confront the bomber's ideology for the first time, absorbing his unsettlingly persuasive arguments against technology. Yet, quietly hidden among those readers, someone experiences a deeply personal shock, a recognition so profound, it will ultimately unravel Ted Kaczynski's carefully protected anonymity. Meanwhile, back in his isolated Montana cabin, Ted quietly celebrates this public victory. Finally, society must confront his ideology directly, forced by his violence into giving him a national platform. Yet, paradoxically, publication also quietly deepens his paranoia. Every passing aircraft, each stranger wandering near his property, now seems threatening. He imagines FBI agents closing in, quietly encircling him, hidden surveillance now everywhere. His journals reveal intense psychological strain. Despite his outward satisfaction, success has brought profound fear, deepening his internal turmoil. Ironically, this manifesto, Kaczynski's greatest triumph, becomes simultaneously his greatest mistake. One quirky yet crucial tidbit emerges clearly: Ted's younger brother, David Kaczynski, quietly reads the published manifesto, initially skeptical yet deeply troubled. Something about the author's style, arguments, and obsessive focus strikes him as eerily familiar. He wrestles privately with deep dread, quietly suspecting his estranged brother. Eventually, overcome by quiet horror, he begins privately comparing Ted's letters, preserved from earlier correspondence, to the Unabomber's manifesto. Similarities, initially subtle, become undeniable. David faces an agonizing dilemma: betray family loyalty or potentially allow violence to continue? Quietly and cautiously, David reaches out to authorities, anonymously at first, carefully sharing his suspicions. Investigators, wary yet intrigued, follow this lead cautiously. Could the Unabomber, after decades of anonymity, finally have been identified through his own words? Agents quietly and discreetly begin investigating Ted Kaczynski, meticulously analyzing every detail of his past, examining his education, habits, and personality. Slowly but surely, their suspicions grow stronger. Every detail fits alarmingly well. This moment marks a dramatic turning point. Kaczynski's careful anonymity, which had confounded investigators for nearly 2 decades, suddenly teeters precariously. His desire for public recognition, ironically, becomes his undoing, offering the FBI its most significant breakthrough yet. Ted's meticulously constructed isolation finally cracks under the weight of his own words, the first true evidence connecting the quiet man in Montana to the notorious Unabomber. Yet, quietly hidden from public view, internal FBI debates still rage fiercely. Agents cautiously weigh possibilities. Could this be yet another false lead, another frustrating dead end, another agonizing disappointment? Or have they finally found their elusive enemy, hiding quietly in plain sight for decades? Public pressure mounts relentlessly. Investigators quietly fear another bombing, anxious not to repeat past mistakes. They move carefully, desperately cautious, terrified of prematurely tipping their hand and losing their chance at finally capturing Ted Kaczynski. As you step back quietly from this pivotal moment, you sense something profound shifting. For years, investigators chased ghosts, endlessly frustrated. Now, for the first time, they quietly hold tangible hope, a real suspect, a genuine possibility, one tantalizingly close yet frustratingly elusive. Kaczynski, meanwhile, quietly celebrates public exposure, oblivious that his greatest triumph has quietly initiated his downfall. Hold carefully to this quiet suspense, everything soon accelerates rapidly. The anonymity that protected Kaczynski for nearly 2 decades begins dissolving quietly yet decisively. Investigators quietly prepare their next move, carefully inching toward a final confrontation. For now, the quiet tension holds firm, poised delicately between discovery and disaster. Remember this moment vividly. It marks the quiet unraveling of anonymity itself, the beginning of Ted Kaczynski's slow yet inevitable downfall. You now find yourself quietly stepping into one of the most emotionally charged chapters of the Unabomber saga, David Kaczynski's agonizing journey toward suspicion, confrontation, and ultimately, betrayal. Imagine quietly standing in David's shoes, holding the Unabomber's published manifesto in trembling hands, feeling your stomach twist into knots as you recognize familiar phrasing, ideas, and obsessive patterns that unmistakably echo your estranged brother's voice. It's a feeling few can genuinely understand, the devastating certainty that someone you once knew intimately might secretly be a notorious criminal whose violence has terrorized America for nearly 2 decades. David's discovery isn't immediate but emerges slowly, quietly, almost reluctantly. He initially dismisses his troubling suspicions as paranoia. After all, who could genuinely believe their brother, a shy, withdrawn, eccentric genius, perhaps, but a bomber, a murderer? But as David reads further, the similarities become hauntingly undeniable. Ted's letters, stored quietly away over the years, carry identical phrasing, distinctive punctuation habits, peculiar terms, and especially the obsessive focus on the dangers of technology, civilization's corruption, and the need for radical change. David experiences profound turmoil, family loyalty quietly battling moral responsibility, love weighed silently against justice. Should he quietly ignore his suspicions, rationalizing away each disturbing similarity? Or should he bravely confront what he increasingly senses to be a terrifying truth? Imagine yourself in his position, wrestling privately, night after night, the silence of the room amplifying doubts, fears, and painful memories. You might consider the profound irony here. Ted, the master of quiet isolation, now unknowingly forces his brother into his own solitary torment. In desperation, David quietly confides in his wife, Linda, carefully sharing suspicions he finds unbearable alone. Linda cautiously agrees. The parallels between Ted's private letters and the manifesto seem far too significant to dismiss as mere coincidence. Yet both hesitate, reluctant to involve authorities prematurely. They quietly hope for some overlooked detail, some decisive proof that might confirm or refute their fears conclusively. Quietly, secretly, David and Linda painstakingly gather old letters, comparing them meticulously against the published manifesto. You imagine them sitting silently at the kitchen table late into the night, letters spread out carefully, the quiet tick of a clock underscoring each troubling discovery. David's dread quietly intensifies with every matching phrase, each distinctive linguistic quirk Ted consistently employs. Historians still argue whether David's cautious, private investigation was courageously thorough or emotionally hesitant, driven by understandable denial. Regardless, the process itself becomes quietly heartbreaking, each confirmed detail further shattering David's fragile hope that his brother might be innocent. Eventually, their quiet certainty becomes overwhelming. After weeks of painful deliberation, David and Linda decide, carefully, cautiously, to seek outside help, anonymously at first. David contacts a private investigator, carefully explaining his suspicions without immediately naming Ted directly. Slowly, discreetly, the investigator examines the evidence, finally advising David that his concerns must be quietly presented to authorities. David now faces the most agonizing decision imaginable, reporting his brother, knowing fully the profound consequences. In early 1996, David quietly approaches the FBI, maintaining anonymity, hoping to protect Ted from unjust suspicion in case he proves wrong. FBI agents, cautious yet intrigued, recognize immediately the uniqueness of this tip: family involvement, linguistic clues, ideological parallels, all unprecedented in this lengthy investigation. Quietly yet urgently, agents request more letters, deeper insights into Ted's personality, and details from his childhood, education, and adult life. David, deeply conflicted yet quietly determined to prevent further violence, complies fully, meticulously recounting every memory, every peculiar detail about his brother's habits, thoughts, and beliefs. Yet the process becomes quietly complicated. David insists Ted receive mental health care if captured, fearing imprisonment without proper psychiatric treatment would be unjustly cruel. Agents quietly agree initially, careful not to alienate David, whose cooperation proves invaluable. Behind closed doors, however, internal FBI debates grow tense. Should they promise leniency, or is their primary obligation public safety, accountability, and justice for victims? Investigators quietly tread carefully, recognizing the immense emotional strain David endures. Quietly, painfully, David continues cooperating, even as public suspicion shifts closer to Ted. Investigators carefully gather extensive evidence, travel records matching bombing timelines, financial records tracing materials purchases, and countless other subtle connections quietly building a compelling case. David, meanwhile, faces immense personal anguish. Imagine the emotional burden, living daily with profound guilt, relentless anxiety, and heartbreaking uncertainty. Publicly, David maintains silence, privately hoping Ted might peacefully surrender if confronted gently. Meanwhile, quietly hidden from public view, Ted remains oblivious to this deeply personal betrayal. His isolation, carefully constructed over decades, ironically leaves him blind to the quiet threat now posed by his own family. Inside his Montana cabin, Kaczynski continues quietly planning further attacks, increasingly isolated emotionally, unaware the FBI carefully closes in, guided by clues provided secretly by his brother. Yet the irony isn't lost on you. The very anonymity that protected Ted for decades now works quietly against him. With each detail David quietly provides, the FBI edges nearer, patiently constructing an airtight case. The invisible net carefully tightens, unknown to the Unabomber himself, whose meticulous paranoia never anticipates betrayal from family. Quietly, invisibly, his downfall begins. This chapter resonates deeply in true crime history, echoing infamous betrayals in notorious cases, the Lindbergh kidnapping, John Gotti's downfall facilitated by trusted associates, even Jesse James' assassination by close companions. David's quiet betrayal remains profoundly complex historically, ethically debated still. Was it courageous self-sacrifice, prioritizing public safety over family loyalty? Or was it deeply tragic, irreversibly fracturing family bonds forever? Regardless, the emotional consequences prove profound, privately devastating David, whose life quietly changes irreversibly afterward. Yet publicly, he becomes widely praised, reluctantly viewed as a hero whose courage ended decades of terror. Still, privately, David endures painful guilt, quietly haunted by the lifelong question, did he make the right choice? As you quietly leave this emotional chapter, remember clearly its profound complexity, loyalty, betrayal, justice, and love all tangled quietly together. David's decision, agonizingly difficult, finally gives investigators decisive clarity. Ted Kaczynski's anonymity quietly ends, not through forensic brilliance or investigative breakthroughs, but quietly, simply, through words written decades earlier, preserved silently by family. Keep this emotional complexity vividly in mind. The final confrontation now approaches, driven quietly yet irrevocably by family betrayal. Investigators carefully prepare, agents quietly close in, and Ted Kaczynski, utterly unaware, silently awaits a confrontation decades in the making. You now quietly find yourself drifting into the meticulous world of forensic linguistics, the methodical science of words becoming weapons in criminal investigations. It's early 1996, and Ted Kaczynski's anonymous war against modern society is quietly nearing its conclusion, not through fingerprints, DNA, or eyewitness testimony, but through language itself. The FBI, now armed with David Kaczynski's crucial insights, turns with renewed urgency to linguistic analysis, hoping desperately that the words Ted chose so carefully might finally betray him. Inside a quiet, windowless room, FBI linguistic analysts gather around tables piled high with printed pages, notebooks, and computer printouts. They dissect every line of Kaczynski's infamous manifesto, cross-referencing it meticulously against letters Ted wrote decades earlier, supplied by his brother David. This painstaking process, slow, tedious, yet quietly thrilling, represents an unprecedented method of criminal investigation, a subtle reminder that words, carefully chosen, are just as uniquely identifiable as fingerprints. You can almost feel the intensity of their careful work, each analyst hunched over, eyes narrowed, pen scribbling quietly in margins. Linguistic forensics, still relatively new at this scale, previously proved effective in smaller cases, identifying anonymous authors of threatening letters or solving literary mysteries, but nothing remotely this complex, high-profile, or urgent. Analysts quietly understand their responsibility. If they fail here, Kaczynski could continue terrorizing America indefinitely. The task is quietly daunting. Linguists carefully examine every facet of language, sentence structure, syntax, punctuation, spelling habits, vocabulary choices, even subtle grammatical quirks, hoping desperately to confirm that Ted Kaczynski, the quiet recluse from Montana, matches the anonymous bomber's written identity. Initially, small similarities quietly emerge, shared phrases, unusual terminology, and uniquely meticulous punctuation habits. But skepticism remains. Could these matches be coincidental, common enough to appear in unrelated writers? Yet, quietly, deeper matches soon emerge, highly distinctive linguistic fingerprints difficult to dismiss. One quirky yet critical detail involves Ted's obsessive use of certain rare phrases, such as cool-headed logicians and eat your cake and have it too, instead of the more common have your cake and eat it too. Analysts carefully note such distinctive inversions, rare linguistic habits almost uniquely tied to Ted's writing style. Another subtle clue emerges from punctuation, Ted's obsessive use of hyphens, precise comma placement, and consistent stylistic quirks meticulously replicated across decades. Imagine the quiet excitement as these linguistic pieces slowly come together, each subtle similarity, individually unremarkable, quietly accumulating into a powerful portrait. Investigators remain cautious yet increasingly optimistic, feeling for the first time in decades that genuine progress emerges from the chaos. Historians still argue whether linguistic forensics alone would have definitively identified Kaczynski without family assistance. Was this breakthrough primarily linguistic brilliance or David's courageous cooperation? Either way, analysts quietly celebrate their meticulous progress, sensing the end approaching. In parallel, FBI agents quietly scrutinize Kaczynski's personal history, building a detailed profile. Ted's education, childhood isolation, Harvard psychological experiments, and Montana cabin solitude, all meticulously examined. Each detail quietly reinforces linguistic findings. His scholarly background perfectly matches the Manifesto's intellectually rigorous style. His ideological obsessions, clearly documented in personal journals and earlier writings, align seamlessly with the Manifesto's radical philosophies. Each quiet connection strengthens investigators' confidence, providing deeper credibility to linguistic matches. As these linguistic findings quietly solidify, internal FBI discussions shift from speculation to preparation. Investigators cautiously plan surveillance of Kaczynski's cabin, aware of the enormous stakes. Move too quickly, and they risk tipping off their elusive target, potentially prompting further violence or enabling escape. Move too slowly, and they risk more bombings, more victims, more public fear. Agents quietly grapple intensely with this precarious balance, meticulously preparing every detail, understanding that their careful planning is essential to finally ending Kaczynski's anonymous reign of terror. Meanwhile, quietly oblivious in Montana, Kaczynski grows increasingly paranoid yet cautiously continues his deadly work, unaware linguistic analysts have quietly decoded his anonymity. He carefully prepares another explosive device, meticulously planning its delivery, utterly oblivious that language itself, his chosen weapon, now quietly targets him. Historically, this quiet victory of linguistic forensics marks a significant milestone, echoing earlier forensic breakthroughs, fingerprint identification famously solving London's Great Train robbery, DNA forensics dramatically identifying criminals previously impossible to convict, even handwriting analysis crucially aiding the Lindbergh kidnapping case. Yet linguistic analysis, uniquely subtle yet deeply compelling, represents a quieter, intellectually rigorous forensic evolution, now proven undeniably powerful in one of America's most infamous investigations. As FBI analysts quietly complete their meticulous linguistic analysis, they present a confident, carefully documented conclusion: Ted Kaczynski's writing matches the Unabomber's manifesto with overwhelming certainty. Investigators quietly feel renewed energy, finally possessing credible, legally actionable evidence. The stage is set, linguistic fingerprints have quietly unraveled decades of anonymity, finally exposing Kaczynski as the Unabomber beyond reasonable doubt. Still, investigators quietly approach cautiously, carefully monitoring Kaczynski from afar. Surveillance teams quietly watch his isolated cabin, FBI officials discreetly seek legal warrants, prosecutors quietly prepare criminal charges, all conducted silently, meticulously, determinedly. Each day carefully brings investigators closer, yet quietly, they proceed slowly, methodically, knowing haste risks catastrophic failure. In Kaczynski's quiet isolation, meanwhile, paranoia quietly intensifies. He senses, though doesn't fully grasp, subtle shifts around him. A quiet unease, a subconscious suspicion grows silently. Though meticulous, he cannot entirely suppress instinctual anxiety. His journals, later discovered, quietly document increasing stress, paranoia quietly escalating with every passing day. Quietly, invisibly, the walls close in around Ted Kaczynski. Linguistic forensics, painstakingly careful, finally breach anonymity's protective barrier, exposing him as America's most wanted bomber. Investigators prepare for their final move, understanding clearly the enormous stakes involved. Kaczynski, obliviously meticulous, continues his dangerous obsession, unaware language itself quietly, relentlessly condemns him. As you quietly step away from this fascinating chapter, hold carefully onto its subtle brilliance. Words, carefully chosen, quietly yet undeniably revealed America's anonymous terrorist. Language, meticulously analyzed, quietly brought justice closer than fingerprints or eyewitnesses ever could. Remember clearly this quiet power, because linguistic forensics, uniquely subtle yet undeniably powerful, quietly reshaped criminal investigation history forever. The quiet countdown toward capture has begun, investigators prepared, Kaczynski unsuspecting. Soon, anonymity quietly collapses entirely, replaced by a carefully orchestrated confrontation decades overdue. Hold carefully onto the quiet suspense, the final moments approach swiftly, silently, decisively. You quietly step now toward April 3, 1996, a chilly morning in Lincoln, Montana, the kind of crisp spring day that feels deceptively calm, where the wilderness breathes softly beneath a pale sky. Yet hidden beneath this peaceful veneer, an intense drama unfolds. Ted Kaczynski, unaware of imminent confrontation, moves quietly around his secluded cabin, preparing breakfast, stoking the small wood stove, perhaps jotting down notes for future attacks. He's oblivious to the silent circle of FBI agents meticulously closing around him, each movement carefully orchestrated after decades of painstaking investigation. From the FBI's perspective, today's operation is exceptionally tense, meticulously planned yet riddled with quiet anxiety. Every agent quietly recognizes the enormous stakes, capturing Kaczynski alive, safely, conclusively, without injury or escape, finally ending nearly 2 decades of terror. Any misstep risks disaster, potential violence, another bombing, or Kaczynski quietly disappearing back into anonymity. Imagine their quiet tension, agents carefully camouflaged, hidden among dense pines, weapons quietly holstered yet ready, hearts pounding steadily beneath practiced calm. At sunrise, agents quietly move into position, silently communicating with subtle gestures and whispered radios. Surveillance teams, hidden patiently for days, confirm Kaczynski remains oblivious. The cabin, small yet meticulously organized, sits silently, smoke gently curling from its chimney, giving no indication of threat. You might feel the profound irony, this tiny, modest structure hiding America's most notorious domestic terrorist, its humble appearance quietly belying decades of violent menace. Quietly, cautiously, agents approach, forming a tight perimeter around the property. Silence itself becomes a weapon, their most potent tool. Ted's paranoia, intensely cultivated through isolation, has sensitized him to noises and disruptions. Any careless sound risks tipping him off. Agents quietly hold their breath, movements careful, deliberate, painstakingly cautious. Every step toward the cabin, quiet yet purposeful, marks the culmination of an investigation spanning nearly 20 years, hundreds of thousands of work hours, and millions of dollars. At precisely mid-morning, the silence finally breaks. FBI agents, voices carefully authoritative yet calm, call out Kaczynski's name. They demand his immediate surrender. Inside the cabin, Ted freezes momentarily, confusion and panic quietly flashing through his mind. Yet surprisingly, resistance never materializes. Quietly, almost submissively, Kaczynski emerges, hands raised slightly, eyes wide with bewilderment and resignation. For a moment, the forest seems suspended in time, nature itself quietly witnessing this dramatic climax, the final end of Ted Kaczynski's decades-long anonymity. As you watch agents carefully handcuff Kaczynski, gently yet firmly securing him, you sense the surreal calm that settles quietly over everyone present. Relief washes subtly through agents, quiet satisfaction replacing anxiety, cautious victory replacing frustration. This arrest, executed meticulously, flawlessly, without injury or escape, marks a profound historical moment in American criminal justice, quietly concluding one of the most infamous manhunts ever conducted. Inside the cabin, investigators begin quietly documenting evidence, carefully preserved notebooks, extensive bomb-making materials, meticulous records of previous attacks, detailed future plans chillingly outlined. Every item, painstakingly catalogued, quietly confirms Kaczynski's guilt beyond doubt, meticulously completing the investigative puzzle. His careful anonymity, once so frustratingly elusive, finally dissolves completely, replaced by clear, overwhelming evidence. A quirky yet deeply unsettling detail emerges clearly. Amid explosives and intricate tools lie stacks of meticulously organized journals, filled obsessively with Kaczynski's philosophical writings and personal grievances. These journals, thousands of handwritten pages, later fascinate historians and psychologists, meticulously documenting his gradual ideological radicalization, deep psychological struggles, and intense hatred of technology. Each carefully composed page quietly illustrates the meticulous, obsessive mind behind decades of anonymous terror. Historians still argue whether Kaczynski's peaceful surrender indicates genuine remorse, psychological exhaustion, or simply pragmatic resignation. Did he quietly realize escape was impossible, accepting arrest as inevitable? Or was he secretly relieved, welcoming an end to decades of isolation, paranoia, and relentless violence? Regardless, the quiet ease of his surrender surprises investigators profoundly. After decades hunting a violent, anonymous enemy, Kaczynski's passive compliance quietly contrasts sharply with expectations of resistance or violence. As news quietly spreads nationwide, public reaction is intense yet cautiously optimistic. After decades of anxiety, confusion, and quiet dread, Americans finally see the elusive Unabomber's face, disheveled, thin, aged prematurely by harsh isolation. Yet beneath initial shock lies quiet relief. The anonymous menace terrorizing mailboxes for nearly 20 years finally stands quietly captured, defeated, harmless. Newspapers quietly run photographs, Kaczynski's cabin, its simplicity sharply contrasting earlier imaginations of sinister sophistication. Television reporters quietly recount his dramatic capture, FBI agents humbly acknowledging decades of tireless effort. Ironically, Ted's arrest marks a profound yet quiet transformation for his brother, David. Publicly praised yet privately conflicted, David faces quiet personal anguish. Did he betray family loyalty unfairly, or courageously prioritize justice and public safety? His quiet torment remains painfully complex, emotionally unresolved, even decades later. Yet publicly, David quietly emerges heroically, praised nationwide for bravery, compassion, and moral courage amid intense emotional difficulty. As Kaczynski quietly awaits trial, FBI investigators finally relax cautiously, quiet pride mingled carefully with humility. Their meticulous investigation, despite intense frustration and setbacks, ultimately succeeded. Quietly, methodically, carefully, they achieved justice, ending nearly 2 decades of terror, restoring quiet safety to mailboxes nationwide. This quiet capture resonates deeply within true crime history, echoing infamous arrests, Charles Manson's dramatic ranch capture, Timothy McVeigh's apprehension following the Oklahoma City bombing, Al Capone's quiet defeat through meticulous forensic accounting. Yet Kaczynski's arrest, uniquely prolonged, quietly highlights patient investigative persistence, psychological profiling subtle strengths and limitations, and linguistic forensics remarkable power. Together, these techniques, quietly refined, patiently applied, conclusively resolved America's most elusive criminal mystery. As you quietly leave this dramatic chapter, hold clearly onto its quiet yet profound lessons. Meticulous persistence overcame frustration, subtle forensics surpassed traditional methods, quiet determination conquered anonymous terror. Remember vividly this quiet triumph, an elusive enemy finally defeated through patience, intellect, and unyielding dedication. The decades-long manhunt quietly concludes here. Ted Kaczynski, anonymous no more, finally captured. Yet, quietly awaiting justice, his complicated journey still faces one crucial chapter: the dramatic courtroom confrontation, ideological battles, and psychological revelations quietly awaiting America's most infamous bomber. Hold carefully on to quiet suspense. Kaczynski's final reckoning now approaches swiftly, quietly, inevitably. You now quietly step into a crowded courtroom in Sacramento, California, January 1998, where the infamous Unabomber finally faces justice. After nearly 2 decades of meticulously hidden terror, Ted Kaczynski sits solemnly, appearing detached from the profound drama unfolding around him. Gone is the safety of isolation. Now, beneath harsh fluorescent lights, Kaczynski confronts his victims, their families, and a nation eager for answers. The prosecution methodically presents its case, meticulously detailing each bombing. Forensic evidence painstakingly recovered from Kaczynski's remote Montana cabin, including journals outlining every explosive device, bomb-making components, and incriminating letters, form an undeniable chain linking Kaczynski directly to the attacks. Prosecutors calmly describe the injuries, the suffering, and the irreparable harm caused by his calculated violence, painting him as a ruthless terrorist motivated solely by ideological fanaticism. In sharp contrast, defense attorneys cautiously argue for leniency, presenting Kaczynski as severely mentally ill, a man broken by prolonged isolation, childhood traumas, and unethical psychological experiments at Harvard. Extensive psychiatric evaluations diagnosing paranoid schizophrenia and obsessive-compulsive disorder form the basis of their arguments. Defense lawyers plead quietly yet insistently for compassion, suggesting Ted's mind, although brilliant, was deeply fractured, driven by uncontrollable delusions rather than coherent ideological convictions. Yet, seated at the defense table, Kaczynski vehemently rejects any portrayal of insanity. He demands to represent himself, desperately seeking to publicly defend his ideological positions. The court, however, denies his request after reviewing substantial psychiatric evidence, deciding self-representation would amount to judicial malpractice due to his compromised mental state. Kaczynski, visibly frustrated, reluctantly concedes, silently enduring the remainder of proceedings. Unexpectedly, as tension mounts, Kaczynski agrees to a plea deal, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to avoid the potential death penalty. A subdued relief fills the courtroom. The drama of a prolonged trial is avoided, yet questions linger. Was justice fully served without a complete airing of his ideological arguments? Victims' families depart quietly, torn between relief and dissatisfaction, knowing some answers remain forever unspoken. Inside a federal penitentiary, Ted Kaczynski quietly begins serving his sentence, yet his ideological voice, though publicly silenced, continues privately through writings shared among sympathetic circles. For law enforcement, it is a bitterly won victory, one marked by ethical complexities and moral ambiguities. Justice has been delivered, but profound psychological and philosophical questions remain unresolved, quietly echoing long after the courtroom doors close. You now carefully venture into the complicated landscape of Ted Kaczynski's mind, where psychological complexity meets ideological conviction. Decades of profound isolation, obsessive meticulousness, and deeply embedded mistrust shaped a psyche so intricate it defies simple classification. Early childhood traumas laid the groundwork for lifelong emotional isolation. Hospitalized as an infant, young Ted experienced profound abandonment and vulnerability, permanently altering his ability to form emotional connections. School years intensified this isolation. He displayed extraordinary intellect but profound social withdrawal, obsessive behavior, and anxiety. These early experiences created deep psychological scars that quietly festered, setting the stage for later extremism. At Harvard, psychological experiments further fractured his mental stability. Subjected to humiliating interrogations designed to psychologically destabilize participants, Ted's paranoia and distrust of authority deepened irreparably. Psychologists and historians still debate whether these unethical experiments triggered or merely intensified existing mental illness, yet their impact clearly accelerated his psychological deterioration. Extreme solitude in his Montana cabin exacerbated these vulnerabilities. Journals meticulously document obsessive-compulsive behaviors, paranoia, and severe anxiety. Psychologists later noted classic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, delusional beliefs in surveillance, persecution, and grand conspiracies involving technology and government control. Yet, privately, Ted fiercely denied mental illness, passionately defending his ideological coherence and rationality. Complicating matters further, Kaczynski's journals reveal profound internal conflict, moral struggles and self-doubt quietly battled ideological certainty. Though publicly resolute, privately he often agonized over the ethics of violence, meticulously recording his anxiety and guilt alongside ideological justifications. These contradictions highlight a profoundly disturbed yet rationally articulate mind, leaving scholars permanently divided over whether mental illness or ideological conviction primarily drove his violence. Ultimately, Ted Kaczynski embodies historical complexities seen in other radical extremists who merge psychological disturbance with genuine ideological zeal. His story quietly echoes infamous historical cases like Timothy McVeigh and Anders Breivik, figures who similarly blended deep psychological fractures with ideological certainty. The intersection between mental illness and radical ideology remains unresolved historically, permanently complicating how society understands such violence. In prison, Kaczynski continues privately advocating ideological positions, meticulously defending their rational coherence. Historians and psychologists remain passionately divided, still debating whether his violence was primarily symptomatic of mental disorder, genuine ideological conviction, or an inseparable, troubling blend of both. This profound psychological ambiguity permanently complicates historical understanding, embedding deep questions into public consciousness about mental health, morality, and ideological extremism. You now quietly explore the lasting societal impacts triggered by Ted Kaczynski's decades-long reign of anonymous terror, subtle yet profound changes reshaping American society's security, investigative practices, and cultural consciousness. Before Kaczynski, domestic terrorism was primarily perceived as an organized group phenomenon. The Unabomber attacks shifted this perception dramatically, revealing threats could quietly emerge from solitary actors, intelligent, isolated, motivated by personal or philosophical grievances. Law enforcement agencies quickly adapted, incorporating behavioral and linguistic analysis alongside traditional methods. FBI practices fundamentally evolved, acknowledging the emergence of lone wolf terrorism, and profoundly reshaping investigative methodologies. Institutionally, security protocols permanently changed. Universities, airlines, and corporations introduced meticulous mail screening and surveillance measures. Previously mundane tasks, opening mail, receiving parcels, became cautiously regarded activities, permanently embedding subtle anxieties into everyday life. Culturally, Kaczynski's profile influenced popular media profoundly. Films, novels, and television began frequently depicting isolated intellectual antagonists, characters echoing Kaczynski's real-life isolation and genius. This quiet cultural shift subtly reshaped public perceptions of intellectual isolation, associating genius with potential menace. Philosophically, Kaczynski's Manifesto unintentionally sparked legitimate debates about technology's social and environmental impacts. Though his methods were universally condemned, scholars quietly acknowledged valid concerns raised by his critiques of technological dependence, environmental degradation, and societal alienation. Ethical complexities persist. Did his violence irreparably damage these important discussions, or ironically amplify their significance? Quietly significant, family ethics debates also emerged prominently. David Kaczynski's decision to report his brother raised profound questions about familial loyalty versus public safety. Similar historical dilemmas, families confronting relatives involved in ideological extremism, quietly echoed, permanently complicating societal understandings of family responsibility. Thus, Kaczynski's lasting legacy quietly reshaped American society's security practices, cultural narratives, philosophical debates, and ethical discussions around family, technology, and mental health. These subtle yet profound shifts persistently echo, deeply embedded into the fabric of contemporary life, permanently influencing how America understands safety, isolation, extremism, and ethical responsibility. Finally, you enter the deeply unresolved historical debate surrounding Ted Kaczynski's true nature, a passionately argued academic controversy persisting decades after his imprisonment. Historians and scholars remain permanently divided. Was Kaczynski primarily a mentally ill criminal, profoundly delusional and dangerous, or a misguided revolutionary whose critiques of technology contain genuine philosophical insights? Some scholars argue his paranoid schizophrenia and extreme isolation indicate severe mental illness as the primary cause for his violence, portraying his ideology as symptomatic of delusional paranoia rather than legitimate critique. Conversely, others cautiously acknowledge his violence as morally reprehensible yet insist his ideological arguments, criticisms of technological society, environmental destruction, and human alienation, are historically relevant and intellectually valid. They argue Kaczynski, though profoundly disturbed, articulated genuinely prescient philosophical concerns deserving thoughtful consideration. These debates profoundly complicate moral evaluations. Does acknowledging legitimacy in his critiques inadvertently excuse or rationalize violence? Conversely, does dismissing all his concerns risk ignoring real societal anxieties? The ethical tension remains historically unresolved. Further complexities emerge regarding judicial and media ethics. Was it morally justified to publish his manifesto? Did denying his self-representation constitute prudent caution or judicial censorship? Familial ethics debates remain equally complicated, permanently dividing opinion on whether reporting family members involved in ideological extremism constitutes civic duty or tragic betrayal. These passionately argued historical debates profoundly complicate easy conclusions about Kaczynski's legacy. His story permanently embeds unresolved questions about mental health, morality, ideology, and ethics into historical consciousness, quietly influencing contemporary understandings of extremism and social responsibility, forever debated yet never conclusively answered. You quietly arrive now at the lasting, haunting echoes Ted Kaczynski's story leaves imprinted on society, echoes lingering long after the case closed, far beyond prison walls and courtrooms. Decades removed from his arrest, Kaczynski's name still evokes a complex mixture of dread, fascination, and deep-seated societal anxiety. He remains, perhaps unintentionally, a symbol that encapsulates modern society's quiet unease with technology, isolation, and invisible dangers lurking beneath ordinary life. The Unabomber's legacy profoundly altered the way Americans understand personal safety. Before Kaczynski, threats of violence were typically associated with clearly identifiable groups or foreign actors. Afterward, there emerged a quieter, more disturbing recognition that serious threats could emanate silently from within society itself, from neighbors, colleagues, or even family. Ted's case reshaped forever the American consciousness, embedding a subtle yet powerful suspicion that no individual, however ordinary, was entirely free from suspicion. Culturally, Ted Kaczynski has quietly become an iconic figure, frequently referenced in popular culture. Books, documentaries, podcasts, films, and television series regularly revisit his narrative, intrigued not only by the meticulous nature of his crimes but also by the profound moral ambiguity surrounding him. Kaczynski embodies something deeply unsettling, an intelligent, articulate person who committed horrific acts, yet whose ideological criticisms of modern society remain disturbingly resonant. The combination of intellectual clarity and moral darkness he represents continues quietly captivating public imagination, symbolizing the troubling intersection of genius, madness, and violence. Yet perhaps most enduringly, Ted Kaczynski remains embedded within contemporary anxieties about technology's role in human life. In a world now dominated by digital surveillance, artificial intelligence, and environmental catastrophe, his bleak warnings about technological overreach feel eerily prescient. While society universally condemns his violent methods, there persists a quiet discomfort, a recognition that beneath his terrible acts lay uncomfortable truths about the alienating effects of modern technology, human vulnerability, and environmental exploitation. In law enforcement and psychological communities, Kaczynski permanently reshaped strategies for handling lone offenders and solitary radicalization. The concept of the lone wolf attacker became deeply entrenched in security dialogues, influencing how authorities detect, profile, and investigate isolated threats. Ted's careful anonymity and solitary operation now serve as both a cautionary tale and a grim template, guiding professionals in their attempts to prevent future violence by similarly isolated individuals. Public perception of mental health also quietly shifted after Kaczynski. His case underscored a painful societal failure, the inability to adequately recognize, address, or intervene in cases of severe isolation and mental deterioration before tragedy occurs. Today, mental health professionals, educators, and policymakers still grapple with the difficult question of how best to support profoundly isolated individuals to prevent radicalization. Kaczynski's legacy quietly underscores the urgent need for mental health resources, ethical psychological practices, and early intervention in schools and communities nationwide. Ironically, Ted himself remains alive, quietly imprisoned yet symbolically active, his writings still circulating privately, fueling ongoing debates among certain philosophical circles. His manifestos, letters, and reflections continue quietly influencing fringe intellectual communities skeptical of modernity, surveillance, and technological progress. Though publicly discredited, these writings privately persist, keeping his ideological voice quietly alive, embedding a quiet tension within society's broader conversation about progress and freedom. Historically, Ted Kaczynski's narrative resonates alongside other tragic figures whose complex legacies profoundly unsettle public consciousness, figures whose violent acts overshadow genuine philosophical concerns, complicating cultural narratives permanently. Yet unlike others, Kaczynski uniquely embodies the modern tension between intellect and alienation, ideological sincerity and horrific violence, technological anxiety and ethical accountability, each quietly embedded within his legacy. As you step away quietly, reflect deeply upon the lasting complexity his story leaves behind. Ted Kaczynski's saga ends not with simple conclusions but with quiet unease, profoundly embedding unresolved ethical, philosophical, psychological, and societal anxieties within public consciousness. The echoes of his crimes continue quietly reverberating through modern culture, permanently complicating America's understanding of safety, technology, isolation, and extremism. In these quiet, lingering echoes, society confronts its deepest anxieties, about progress, humanity, and hidden dangers, reminding us all how fragile normalcy truly is. Ted Kaczynski's story has ended, yet the quiet fears he symbolized persist indefinitely, permanently etched into the collective psyche, whispering warnings from the shadows. The air around you softens now, the tension slowly melting away like mist under a gentle morning sun. Take a deep breath, and let the weight of all you've heard settle quietly into the background. The story of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, may feel heavy, tangled in shadows and sharp edges, but here, in this calm moment, you are safe. There are no ticking bombs, no hidden threats, only the soft hum of life going on beyond these words. Imagine the rustling of leaves far off in a forest, the distant call of a bird, or the gentle breeze brushing softly against your skin. These small sounds remind you of the quiet persistence of normalcy, even after storms have passed. It's a world where darkness exists, yes, but so does light, patience, and healing. And just like the slow turning of the seasons, time will continue to ease the ache left behind by fear and confusion. Remember, while the Unabomber's actions cast a long shadow, they do not define the whole story of humanity. There are countless acts of kindness, bravery, and resilience unfolding every day, quiet heroes who stand for safety, understanding, and hope. And you are part of this ongoing story, able to move forward with knowledge, empathy, and calm. So, as you let your mind drift gently away from this tale, carry with you a sense of peace. Let the soft whisper of the fan in the background, the fading light in your room, and the gentle rhythm of your breath soothe your thoughts. The night is deep, but you are safe. Rest now, knowing that even in the darkest stories, the dawn always comes. Sweet dreams.